Welcome back to the Reactive Training Systems podcast. In today's episode, you'll be hearing from Coach Mike Touchier of Reactive Training Systems, of course, and Bryce Lewis from The Strength Athlete. In this episode, they discuss their opposing viewpoints on coaching, programming, periodization, all things emerging strategies, and ultimately they work towards somewhat of a middle ground. They try to find the commonalities between more of a periodized style of coaching, a more of a top-down style of coaching, and comparing that to the bottom-up style of coaching that we use with emerging strategies. And it is quite an interesting conversation. Hopefully you guys learn a lot from it. If you're a coach that is unsure of what direction to go down, maybe you can learn from both of these coaches who have been doing this for a long time. They've been coaching athletes at all skill levels with slightly different approaches. So if you enjoy this episode, please share it on your Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube, however you share your podcasts. We would greatly appreciate it. And thanks for listening, and let's get right into the episode.
You and I have talked quite a bit on each other's podcasts. I think you've been on mine a couple times, and I think I've been on yours a couple times. And, we've done seminars. We clearly have a good rapport with each other. And I think that makes a conversation, that might have some potential disagreements, more relevant and potentially more productive for everyone. So we can kind of skip over some of the normal podcast stuff of like, hey, how are you? Who are you? And like, we can just kind of jump right into things, I suppose. So today's topic being mostly about planning, training, individualizing training, the processes that go around it, how useful is it, how much is too much, how much is not enough, and kind of wherever things take us from there.
Sweet. So yeah, I've gotten introduced to emerging strategies, I guess, in 2018 in a formal sense when you kind of presented at EPC, and we had some conversations around there. And I think you were kind of, maybe it goes back even a little bit further when you invited me on a group call with some guys from HMMR Media to talk about Bondarchuk and periodization there, I guess. And you'd kind of been curious about what they did and see if there were some interesting ideas you could bring over into powerlifting. But yeah, my goal for today was kind of, let's see if we can start on some common ground by talking about, periodization in the past and what we both think is useful there, and maybe how we got to where we program currently and some interesting things around there.
Sounds good. Yeah.
So I think we've both been big fans of John Kiley for a while, and this rebuttal of like traditional Russian periodization of, you've got the Olympics in 4 years and you've got to figure out how to get your weightlifter or your shot put athlete to the Olympics in peak form. And, just like many other things, you figure out a plan from here to there, and the plan exists more or less in whole, and that's kind of this very, very top-down periodization model.
Yeah.
And so we know that doesn't really apply to powerlifters for many reasons. Forecasting being one of them. We don't know what the hell is going to happen in 2 or 3 months, let alone 2 or 3 years leading out into a quad. But also, athletes aren't physiological beings. And that's it. They're also social creatures, and they're emotional creatures as well. And the impact of all of these things has effects that would be nearly impossible to predict down the road.
Yeah.
So the other way of looking at periodization then is, okay, well, if we're not talking top down, then bottom up, basically creating training as a result of understanding what the athlete is doing and then doing more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff as time goes on. This idea that each athlete needs their own consideration and their own individual process that's a result of some background of emotional state, genetics, lived experience, access to nutrition, adherence, sleep, and this range of other things.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you so far.
Cool. Yeah, so this kind of idea of like standardization. So I guess I want to. It seems that periodization doesn't really have much of a defined definition outside of like a structured ordering of training over time. But I wanted to start off by asking you what you think periodization is.
I mean, I would go with that. So there's a few things that we might be able to sidestep early here. Um, Top down and bottom up planning strategies are, I mean, it's just like linear periodization. It just doesn't exist in the practical world. That if you look at any program, it has linear elements, but it's not purely linear. Nobody's gradually increasing intensity and reducing volume for 6 months at a time or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say it's the same with top down and bottom up planning. If you look at the most Russian powerlifting coach that exists is Boris Shaiko. Like even he doesn't adhere to a rigid top down structure. Like I don't think anyone does that in its purest form. And similarly, if I'm an advocate of bottom up planning, it's still not purely bottom up planning. We don't arrive to the gym with no plan at all, and the plan emerges entirely from the moment. I mean, I have to admit that that's an interesting idea, but that's not real, And so there's always some sort of delineation in the middle, and I think kind of where I'm at with emerging strategy stuff is kind of drawing the line more toward the bottom up side of it than the top down side of it.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you mentioned Kylie too. I just interject real quick that.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think that I would love to be more familiar, I think, with the exact processes that you use for planning and whatnot. But I suspect that given that we're both familiar and fans of John Kiley's work, that there's quite a bit of similarity, even if the processes are not identical.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think as we'll get further in this conversation, we may find that the only difference is the scale of the unit of manipulation that we're talking about. And I think these days your unit is a microcycle and our unit is probably somewhere around 3 weeks long or something like that. That's like your test unit. And I guess we'll get more into that a little bit later, but I'm hoping we'll kind of get there.
Well, I don't know, at the risk of derailing us with things that are just interesting to me, I'm interested in that idea and that aspect of this conversation, to be honest. So like the way that I teach emerging strategies is this, it's a microcycle, which usually ends up being a training week that is repeatable. And the way I teach it, especially in the beginning, is that it's the same training week on repeat, that it's the same exercises, sets, reps, and RPE. So the only thing that's really changing is the weight changes a little bit to help you match the RPE, and that's about it. And I think that's an important step. And I think that it's highly effective. And I've used that. I would say that's the dominant way that I program training for athletes even now. So, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm backing off of that strategy at all, but in my own training, where I'm definitely more experimental, like I'm more experimental with myself than with anyone else. I've experimented with holding different things constant, right? So the idea is that you hold certain things constant and see what the results are. Well, in the kind of emerging strategies doctrine, those things that you hold constant are exercises, sets, reps, RPE. But that doesn't have to be the only thing. It could be like I'm doing this experiment now where I'm holding not reps constant, but velocity loss.
Mm-hmm.
So the reps per set is fluctuating a bit. And I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I think that from an epistemological standpoint, that's a pretty good way to figure it out, is to say, well, I'm just going to keep. There's a couple things here. One is that's a good way to figure it out. And the other is kind of teaching people that you don't have to change all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'm talking to my younger self here, but I kind of came up being taught that programs need to change. Even the fact that every workout was different from every other workout that you've ever done that's just good programming,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
that's kind of how I came up, and that's not the case at all. At least that's not what I believe now.
So one of my starting questions in kind of my section on defining emerging strategies, you put out this post about custom training cycles, kind of talking about emerging strategies and its virtues. And
Yeah.
when you and I talked about it after the fact, you said you were primarily writing that post as a way of comparing against the way that you used to program. So my first question is, what was that way that you used to program?
So that's a really good point, actually. So my background, like way back, is more in like West Side style training, and then I would say when I got more competitive at an international level, I kind of got away from that. Started doing more of the block periodization style, with accumulation, transmutation, and realization blocks, and that whole thing. Uh, Even now, I would say that there are elements of West Side that kind of are still, like, if you look at training that I write, like, you can point to things and say, oh, I see the influence there, and I believe that I can justify those things.
Yeah.
I know that we kind of, our section of the powerlifting community uh, is sometimes we're keen to denigrate West Side and West Side style training, and it's not without reason. But the more I learn about training, the more I see instances where, like, oh, okay, I see how you could justify that, or I see how you could justify this other thing, and so uh, I don't know. I'm kind of going off on a tangent
Well,
here, but I suppose the main thrust is tools in a toolbox.
yeah. And I'd say I agree with you kind of about, you know, I guess it's pretty easy. It's the easier thing to be dogmatic. And these days I'm pretty wary about the seriousness to which people take stories from the past about how to train that may or not actually coincide with reality. Things about Cube and West Side and bodybuilding, and it's the better thing to do, but it's the harder thing to do, to take a step back and view them in the context of where that tool came up with. Like a hammer is a fantastic tool, but not if you're trying to swim, to use it as a swimming aid. And you need flippers for that.
Right.
And so understanding the tool in its context is a really good way of helping you figure out how to use it if you wanted to, and also historically understanding it.
Well, this is a interesting and slightly unexpected turn, I think, because this gets really into your and I philosophy, like just how we view the world in general, and just a difference, an observed difference. I think. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. Uh, I think that I'm not sure how to characterize your position without it sounding like I'm being negative, and I don't intend to be negative, but I think my tendency is to look at the training tools of the past or whenever and try to justify them. That my starting assumption is that this was done for a reason. Let me figure out what that reason. And I think that tends to make me a bit apologetic, and maybe more than I ought to be. So I think if there's a weakness to it, it's kind of over excusing methods that may not be like methods from the past that may not be ideal in a particular context.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I don't like, I actually agree with a lot of that stuff as well. I tend to try to take a look in the past at different solutions to programs and, even where things came, and realize that a lot of what we used to do as powerlifters came from a weightlifting background, and are left figuring out how little or how much those actually apply to a powerlifting scenario.
Yeah.
We've got this weightlifting guy in the gym who trains pretty smart from a weightlifting standpoint, but he's lifting like super heavy all the time, and it would break me, but it's appropriate for weightlifting. And I was just watching some weightlifting before this, and these guys are taking like 3 and 4 kilo jumps in between attempts, and that kind of stuff just changes the way that you program. Like that's less variation than you and I would have in a set.
Right.
So I want to get to this idea of Bondarchuk and understanding which pieces of Bondarchuk you decided to bring into emerging strategies and which pieces you decided don't really apply as much. Kind of speaking of taking bits of other systems.
Well, I would say one aspect of it is something that you've pointed out to me in the past. In the system as Bondarchuk applied it to hammer throw, for example, kind of the basic system, the fundamental system would be to have one workout on repeat. So every workout is the same workout. And, after however many exposures, whenever that stimulus has run its course, then you change. I never really tried that because, for powerlifting, and this seems to me to be like a fundamental difference in the sports, because in powerlifting, that would mean squat, bench, and deadlift in every training session. And what would that even look like? And is there room for literally anything else other than just squat, bench, and deadlift? And you pointed out to me in the past that, if you wanted to start from like ground zero, let's say, it would be to start with just competition, squat, bench, and deadlift, and let the rest of the plan emerge from there. And I tend to start things a bit further down the road than that, but I agree with you that that's kind of the logical endpoint. I just think that if you start with merely the 3 competition lifts and nothing else, even then, like if you train 3-4 days a week, the loads would have to be very carefully managed. The volumes would have to be very carefully managed. Can you imagine that? Like having your heavy workout? Yeah,
yeah.
So, okay, so let's not do that. And actually, one thing that Derek Evely pointed out, so not a powerlifting coach, but kind of steeped in these methods, he suggested, well, what if you did like a squat and bench on day 1 or session 1, and then a deadlift in session 2, and then you could just repeat those. I guess that's viable. That's something that we've toyed around with. It's still a pretty aggressive start.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's some core amount of variability that athletes need to have, both for kind of developing training strength, hypertrophy, and so on, and also just not to pull your hair out with the fact that over a 2-week period you're doing, just the same damn thing every time you go in the gym. And powerlifters are pretty resilient to, being able to just put their nose down and do something pretty boring, especially compared to a lot of other sports. But I think there's this element of variability that saves powerlifters in a lot of ways. And I haven't really figured out exactly what the limits are. And this is definitely a tangent, but I feel like some certain core of variability, either in loading or exercise selection or change in volumes over weeks, helps to keep athletes interested and also helps to reduce injuries. And those are things I care about. And I think in your system, even though you have this static microcycle, you accomplish that by those washout weeks that are 1 or 2 weeks that represent a dramatic influx of new exercises. Am I right?
Yeah, I do find that most athletes don't particularly like the washouts because they're powerlifters, so they like doing powerlifting stuff, and washouts are very different from that. So, it's kind of a thing that they tolerate, but kind of related to that, I did do an experiment one time with like one workout. Let's see how long I can repeat this one workout. And this is also made more possible for me because I'm doing front squat, bench, and pull ups. Like back
Hmm.
squat, bench, and deadlift would be a different story. But so I'm doing this same workout 3 times a week. And the whole block is only 2 weeks at that point, you know, so it's not very long, but it's still very monotonous by the time you get to the end of it. So it's not,
Hmm.
for me at least, it wasn't so much the time that the block takes up, but the repetitiveness like really wore me out.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think that's really true for a lot of athletes, and I find when I don't do that for too long of a time, athletes start getting antsy
Yeah.
and they start asking for new changes, anyways. And so I give them kind of as a way to keep athletes engaged in the training process. And if I anticipate and do it a little bit sooner than expected, there's kind of a nice influx of athlete buy-in.
Yeah.
Um, so there's something interesting there, at least.
Well, what's your take on that then? Like, it seems to me that this aspect of being interested in your training is really important. And I've got to be careful how far I go with this. So our mutual friend Eric Helms will point out that it, there is physiology in play, and that you know
I've
sometimes effective training is
look,
boring, right?
I'm gonna pause you real quick and just say that Eric very badly wanted to be a part of this conversation and will be part of the next one.
All right, I would love to get him. Maybe we ought to just do a whole replay of Eric, you, I, and Greg.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
Anyway, continue.
Yeah, I was just thinking like he would point out that um, physiology is important, and that physiology, he would be able to say this more eloquently, but physiology may not care what you think about it. Um, Even so, it just seems to me that when athletes are interested in their training, it may just simply be an effort thing, but there's some magic that happens when an athlete is interested, engaged, and bought in. And I struggle to explain that in physiologic terms.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thought experiment. Um, let's pretend that you knew in advance what the perfect program for an athlete was, and that program, let's make it 10 weeks long or something like that. This is exactly the opposite of emerging strategies, but this is just the
Sure.
experiment. And
Yeah.
one is the athlete seeks out the coach. They pay the coach. They've seen other team members gaining strength. They're bought into the team, the messaging, everything. And then in the other case, the same exact program is on sale on a website for $2. And they buy that program as one of 100 other programs, but they decided to run this one program. Like it's the same exact stuff on the page. And yet I think they're going to be far more invested in working with you in the first case.
Yeah. Well, that's my friend Jacob likes to point out that there's a lot more to training well than what's written on the page, and that even very detailed programs can't be detailed enough. That what you get with a program is a vague instruction on how to conduct yourself in the gym. But then
Mm-hmm.
I think that's you hear people talk a lot about uh, you know the benefits of training partners, the benefits of training with serious people or strong people, and I wonder how much of that is just modeling. You
Yeah.
train around other strong people who are taking it seriously, who are focused and doing the right things, and so then you also do those things, and a lot of them are intangible. They're difficult to put into words. They may not even be measurable, like things like focus and
Mm-hmm.
intention. like I wouldn't begin to know how to measure those things. But
Yeah.
it's conceivable, at least, that those things are important. And it seems to me that they're probably at least as important as the actual thing. Well, maybe not at least as important, but they're very important even compared to the actual things that are written down on the page. Like if you had somebody who only did like a single at 50% and that was the whole program, then it doesn't matter about intention at that point, granted. But considering a reasonable program, just I guess speaking to your thought experiment, a good program executed well versus a good program executed poorly. I think we have
I've
a
seen
good intuition around that.
For sure. And I've seen kind of cases of that in the wild that seem to apply perfectly. And I guess to just put a period on that sentence, athlete psychology is athlete physiology. We just don't really know
Right.
the mechanisms, and we can't explain it. So, it's mediated, this physiological response, through some combination of hormones or neurotransmitters or something that actually causes a physical change in athletes. It's just either too chaotic or too sensitive for us to do much about it besides use our words with athletes and have that kind of cascade through this system.
Well, a question that kind of relates to this, I think, if we're going to acknowledge um, that I suppose that things like that are relevant to a performance, and in this case, it's an athletic performance. Uh, these psychological biases, maybe psychological um, uh, phenomenon, are relevant to athletic performance. I would say that coaching is also a performance. Uh, that you're playing a role of coach, and that you're presenting yourself in such a way, and that you're making decisions along the way, and that all of those same cognitive biases and um, everything else psychologically is present for the coach as well. So if the coach is tired and not performing well, or distracted or upset, that may affect coaching decisions as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the case. And whether or not we admit to putting on a show when we update our athletes, nevertheless, we're kind of stepping into a role. And, there's certain norms associated with the role about, authority and decision making, and, giving the athlete certain positive or negative criticism, and all these kind of things. And, your mood can absolutely influence how that comes out.
Yeah, yeah. To me as well, it's I've noticed how it's influenced other things as well, like even down to programming decisions. Should I increase this person's workload or not? Well, if I personally just got injured, in my own training, then I've noticed that I'll be a bit more cautious in the decisions that I make. Now,
Yeah.
to some extent, that's inevitable. That you're a human being making decisions in a dynamic environment. However, that always struck me as less than ideal. Like random events that happened to me. Like, quick aside here, I haven't been able to do my laundry in like a month because we're moving and we bought a stupid washer and dryer, and it was supposed to get delivered and then it didn't get delivered. They changed the delivery date and didn't tell me. It was this dumb thing, and it's legitimately frustrating. And I don't think that should affect my athletes. I mean, call me crazy, right? But to
Yeah. Yeah.
me, to me, it's like, okay, what systems can I put into place to minimize things like that? To minimize, um, you know, me underperforming as a coach because I'm distracted or tired, but also don't hamstring my performance when things are normal or good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and these are especially cases where I think that a truly data-driven coaching process helps you be a better coach because they prevent these kinds of detours that have nothing to do with the athlete. They're just kind of noise. Speaking of noise in the program, this is certainly one of them.
Yeah.
So let me keep us on track because I want to make sure I hit a few things before this ends. We could talk for hours and hours. So Bondarchuk had this idea of test exercises that I think you brought over.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of some kind of a weekly thermometer that tells you whether what you're doing is working or not. Can you tell me about how Emerging Strategies has implemented that?
Most commonly, it's with some sort of benchmarking set. I suppose the easiest way to conceptualize that is with like a single at 8 RPE, which has become fairly common practice in powerlifting, I would say. It absolutely does not have to be that, but whatever your heavy set is for this block, that ends up being your benchmarking set because it's most relevant to the competition. So it's a set that's relatively heavy. It's done in the competition exercise. It might be a single, it might be a double or triple or something like that. But you're monitoring that performance from one microcycle to the next, just looking for changes. Really, is performance trending up? Is it trending down? Staying the same, or what have you?
Could you conceive of emerging strategies without something like that? Because I feel like that's somewhat restrictive, even though it's maybe a single or a double. Could it be a set of 5 on pause squats or something like that?
It could be. I think the further afield you go, the less relevant. So this is actually timely because I've been thinking about this more and more, and I've got a friend of mine who's working with some non-powerlifter types and is kind of interested in this. But if you think about it, if you're training, say, a wrestler, what's your benchmark for performance for that wrestler? Well, there's not an equivalent, and that's what makes this system easy to conceptualize for an event like shot put or powerlifting, even where those types of performance measurements are easy and repeatable and measurable. But if you take something that's like a combat sport or a team sport or anything like that, then you have to come up with proxy measurements, and those are very problematic, I would say. So again, like in the case of the wrestler, you may say, okay, we want leg strength. Okay, well, if you want leg strength, let's benchmark to a squat for a set of 5. Well, how do we know that we're developing leg strength and not just squatting ability for that rep range? That's a really difficult question to answer. And yeah, so I mean, in terms of powerlifting, though, from a practical standpoint, I do have blocks where we get away from competition lifting entirely. Those tend to they're development blocks, but they're not really intended to drive the lifts forward. We're not saying, okay, it's training time right now. It's like, hey, this is off-season mode or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So my following questions are kind of about that benchmark lift or about kind of the heavier stuff. And I've seen some athletes who basically take what should be an emerging strategies framework of a static RPE, and they just turn it into what looks like a linear progression from the outside, where they undershoot week 1. Week 2 seems to be about the right RPE. Week 3 is over the RPE, and week 4 is way over the RPE. And I wonder if that throws a wrench in the data and how normal or rare that kind of thing is happening.
That's a good point. So this is something that I think can be aided quite a bit by let's say velocity or something like that, because it's not necessarily the weight on the bar that is the indicator of the progress. It's the it's the estimated 1RM.
Mhm.
And so, like, to the degree that we can generate an accurate estimated 1RM, we should be able to get around at least some of that. Um, if you add 10 pounds to the bar, but it's slower, uh, well, how does that shake out? Well, it depends on how much slower, right? And that
Right.
individual's velocity profile. But if you can generate a reasonably accurate estimated 1RM, you should be able to get around some of that at least. But I do think you're right that, you know, there there seems to be a balance to be walked, right? So if, let's say, your benchmark for this block is a single at 8 RPE. Now, if you're starting out like single at 7 or even easier than that, and just straight weight increases each week, like, well, yeah, you may not be really testing the thing that you're trying to test, even, even if the estimated 1RM is ballpark accurate. But
Yeah.
my my recommendation is to start out closer than that. But I do like the idea of like defaulting to adding a little bit of weight. And I think this has nothing to do really with Bondarchuk or the emerging strategies doctrine. This is just kind of my own bias as a powerlifter, is like, look, you should want to add a little bit more weight. And if the prescription is single at 8 RPE and last week was a single at 8 RPE, then let's default to adding a little bit of weight, like 2.5 kilos, even, just a
Mhm.
little bit. Like, let's want to add some weight to the bar at least, and then if there's a reason not to, then of course be disciplined and don't do that. But and that's just kind of my own personal bias. What's your take on
I
that?
think that's a pretty good bias to have, and I kind of want to segue this question into two things. One is to say that, like, I don't think that, if you programmed 4 to 6 weeks or however long, and you just kind of started off with a lower RP and worked your way up higher, that's a bad thing. In fact, the next piece is just kind of telling you how we tend to program a lot of the times is not dramatic increases in difficulty week to week or dramatic differences week to week. Um, Training is fairly similar, and I think really, if I had to knock emerging strategies for anything, it's just that it is a little bit too restrictive in keeping everything the same on a week to week basis. Whereas we may adjust repetitions over two. Someone may start off with sevens and end with fives, or start off with 6.5 RPE and end with 8 over a few weeks. And over that time, we're responding to information based on how the athlete's doing and changes in estimated 1 rep max. But yeah, I think it's more similar than it is different. It's just the restriction. And so one of my questions is, how different is a set of 5 than a set of 6? Or how different is a single at 7 or a set of 8 when it comes to training response?
See, I'm glad you brought this up. So, for one, we may have touched on this in a previous conversation, just you and I, at some point, but I remember like having a lot of angst around this when I first learned about this, because it seemed like such a good idea to me in terms of being able to understand athlete response and respond to individual differences and stuff like that. And I remember thinking, like, wait a second, there are coaches who I respect a lot, and like, how is it that I'm coming in contact with this idea, but I haven't heard anybody else come in contact with it yet or do things similarly? You know, it was just kind of a skepticism, I guess, of the idea, and how can things be new or something like that. But I
Right, right.
remember feeling a lot of relief when you told me about that, because it was like, oh, see, it's not that different. Like, if you're keeping the weights, like, I remember seeing some Mike Zordo's programming, and it was pretty much the same. There may have been a thing here or there that was different, but it was mostly like, you start at, doing this many triples at 80%, and you add 10 pounds a week, and that yeah, the RPE ratchets up a little bit as you go through the block. And we can talk about potential effects from that from a stress standpoint, but the training effect of doing mostly triples at pretty much the same intensity, like within a couple percent different, I think that's physiologically going to be mostly the same. And then the other component to this, and the one that I think might get some eye rolls from Eric, is is that I think a lot of it depends on athlete perception. Like, to your question on how different is a set of 5 from a set of 6, maybe not that different. And I know Bondarchuk, or at least Derek Evely, talked about like a 10% heuristic, that from one development block to the next, that you should attempt to change the intensity by at least 10%. So it's sufficiently different from the block before it. But I don't think there's anything magic about 10%. And like, how does that relate to different exercises and things like that? And I've talked to some people who perceive like touch and go bench to be very different from competition pause benching. And then other people are like, no, it's pretty much the same thing. And so anyway, that's kind of a long way around of me saying that I think athlete perception has a lot to do with it. So five reps to 6 reps. Well, if you feel like it's a big difference, then, and I could point to some maybe plausible physiological mechanisms that might be going on there for why an athlete might perceive them differently. But I think from an operational standpoint, that perception is important.
Yeah, I think so too, and it's going to influence, what load athletes put on the bar at the very least, and maybe how much arousal they put into the set or something like that. But yeah, just to carry on with kind of the change in reps, I think I typically do that. Well, there's a few pieces that feed on each other, and part of this is, I guess, just me kind of explaining how we do things. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
But typically, I drop reps over the course of a few weeks to make room for increases in intensity, because I view intensity as a thing we care about, and putting more weight on the bar as being able to elicit a specific training response. So I'm sure with working your athletes with static microcycles, if you're doing sets of 6 and you're already working pretty hard, it's going to be pretty difficult to add any weight to the bar each week. And if you do, it's a real indicator that you're making progress. And I think that's important, but it doesn't happen all the time on a week-to-week basis as far as like just actual outright increases in strength. And so typically I drop reps to make for a bigger week-to-week increase in load on the bar. So, by going from 6s to 5s, for example, you can add, anywhere from 2 to 4%. And that's a sizable difference in what the athlete's experiencing, and just gives more room to add load. And as a result, there's only so far you can do that before you run out of reps or you run out of load, and all of a sudden things are at 10 RPE. So it kind of gives you a window of a number of weeks before that strategy has to change. And that's typically between 3 to 6 weeks for us. And it's really interesting to me that coincided with what you told me one time about how long blocks tend to be.
Yeah, I would say kind of 5 or 6 is my average. Yeah, occasionally a bit more, occasionally a bit less. More common shorter than longer as well.
And so one question I have actually about block length is about when to stop. And I saw a post about this from you that says there are kind of a few different types of athlete responses. And there's this concept of time to peak, where there's this relatively stable response to training. And sorry, let me back up a sec. This block length, and sometimes it's shorter and sometimes it's longer, and what we're looking for is kind of a defined stop to a specific strategy. But you said sometimes performance drops and then it goes back up. And that threw this whole wrench in for me
Okay.
about, what if it drops again, but it rises again even further? So when does the
Yeah.
pattern stop and how do you know?
Well, that does happen. And I think one thing that's uh, kind of pervasive through this. So I guess if I'm going to criticize my own messaging around emerging strategies, one criticism might be that um, I start off talking about unpredictability in the body and that we can't know how things are going to be X number of weeks in the future. But then we start looking at past performances and then make assumptions on future performances based on those past performances.
Mm.
We're predicting based on an athlete's past performance. And that isn't possible. But at the same time, I think it's better than not doing that. And it's also the best thing that to some extent, you have to predict. Like that's what a training program is saying, here, if you do this, you'll be better at the end of it. So
Yeah.
there's a prediction that's implicit, you know. Um, so we have to make some prediction, and I just think that, yeah, even though it's a contradiction, it's better to make a prediction that's based on an athlete's own data than anything else. So to go with that, yeah, absolutely. That was one of the things I was warned of early on, is that Derek called them mini peaks, but just this idea that you may improve for a while and kind of have a bad session and then continue improving. And that may happen. So the heuristic that I've used in the past when determining time to peak is that if we get 2 microcycles of kind of a negative movement in our benchmark, then um, it's time to change and do something else. Now, we can't know if that third, the very next microcycle might have seen a big improvement. We just can't know that. But at that point, I'm willing to bet that we wouldn't, and that our time would be better spent, kind of changing and moving on to the next thing. But I mean, I would concede that there's nothing that's kind of logically limiting on that. Like you could say, well, make sure that you go like 5 exposures past your peak just to make sure, or 20 exposures. It doesn't really matter. It's just
Right,
kind of
right.
an arbitrary stop point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I like that you have a heuristic to say, okay, enough's enough. Let's change tactics, because not only are there physiological causes to kind of blowing RPEs, or not even having enough weight on the bar, and there's this psychological piece of, well, it sucks when you underperform, and it
Yeah.
especially sucks when you underperform a few weeks in a row.
Yeah.
And so, do you? Because it sucks when you underperform, my next question is, do you have to wait until a performance downturn to make a change?
No, I don't think so. I've stopped blocks before when performance was still good, but the athlete was feeling beat up, or like I've had athletes tell me, like, look, I feel like I got an injury coming on if I keep pushing this. And some athletes, experienced athletes, will tell me, you know, I don't think I can go another week. Like, I know this week was good, but I'm concerned that if we do this again, that it's going to be, just a bad performance. And that they're telling me this because they don't want that bad performance, and that bad performance is going to affect them. Right. And I think maybe they're right, maybe they're not, but it's better to lean in the direction of the athlete, especially if it's kind of an unknown. I may try to convince them to explore that territory at some point, but lots of times, especially in the beginning, like, look, if you think like next week it ain't gonna happen, then maybe we'll just cut this one a little bit early. And you know, I do think that was the thing that I was warned against, I should say, like when I was first learning about this, is that don't flinch too early. Like and I tend to agree that there's some value in peak performance, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
Brian Miner just had a very interesting blog post on his site. I believe it was a guest post though, about utilizing low RPEs and training for volume work. And the argument was basically those first reps of the set are higher force output reps. And if you think about it from that perspective, that you may want to practice, those high force output repetitions, that I was going to connect that back to this performance in some way, but damn it, I just lost the connection.
Those dudes that were on Brian's guest post are really good. I think I want to talk to them a little bit more. Yeah. They've been putting out good stuff for like a solid year or more, and the guys at Data Driven Strength, I think.
Yeah, it was a really good article. I enjoyed it. I'm trying
to. So
killing me
while you're while you're thinking of that, yeah. I guess one difference between just on the outside programming decisions is that you'll see a performance downturn most of the time and then decide to make a change. Whereas most of the time for me, we decide to extend a week. Like the decision is whether or not to extend rather than to stop. And that's kind of the decision that the ball's in the athlete's court. And so there is this level of athlete individualization. We kind of have a certain starting point. And then if the athlete's responding well, we just keep things running. And if the athlete's starting to hit some RPEs that are too high for what we want, then, we shed some fatigue and restart that process.
Sure. Well, I do like that as well, that it puts it in a language of winning as well. Like you get to the end of the block, it's time for the block to end, and you can go to the athlete and say, hey, you're killing it here. We're making a lot of progress, and you might be able to keep this going for an extra week, and then, decisions follow. On the other hand, what we end up doing is once we've observed kind of and really kind of established the norm, like, hey, after 5 exposures, the 6th exposure is usually not very good. We'll just stop at 5,
Mm-hmm.
and then we get to 5, we end on a high note, and then we move on to something else. So I think creating wins in training is important. And this kind of goes back to the athlete psychology piece that you and I talked about earlier, is that it's important, and I'm not sure how important it is, but it seems really important.
Yeah. So there's this attractive piece about emerging strategies, about coming up with truly individualized programming for the outliers. Not for the middle, because things that will work with one person are pretty likely to work with the other person. So you start working with a new athlete, and you start in a reasonable place, because that's where we start. How do you get to something like insights for Gibbs using an emerging strategies framework, unless you test something like that? And when you test it, how do you decide, what, we're going to try a super low intensity deadlift approach? So,
sorry, you were going to say something else?
Yeah, I mean, basically just what are the mechanisms that get you there?
I suppose that there's some variability between development blocks, and that if you observe that variability, we hope to see some sort of pattern emerge from that, when intensity is low or high, or when certain exercises are present, or things like that, results are better. And then we can kind of continue exploring that variability, so that the variation in the blocks isn't random, it's directed by past performances, and that, some pattern emerges for that athlete, and that is kind of the best data that's available as far as how that individual athlete responds to it. So I mean, this is an important thing that I see that I've arrived at some pretty starkly different programs for different athletes. And that's the process that I've used to arrive at those conclusions. And before I used that process, I didn't have as much variation in the programs that I wrote. Um, so I was wondering kind of about your perspective as well. Like, what is your process like? How do you arrive at I mean, some things are a bit more obvious. If an athlete's feeling beat up, maybe you adjust the volume. That there are some relationships that point to things like knobs on a stereo. But then there's other things that are a little bit harder to nail down. If they responded to one exercises, or it seems like they respond to one exercise, do you do anything with that information, or like how do you parse
Yeah,
signal from
that's a good
noise?
question.
Yeah.
Sometimes we'll have a training approach in where the athlete's doing like safety bar squat on one day and squat on another day. And the reason safety bar squat gets in their program is because maybe we see some technique breakdown in the way they lift, or the athlete just says, hey, I've got this new safety bar squat or this new safety bar, I want to try it.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, sometimes
Yeah.
that's a reason we put something in.
Of course.
But a lot of times it's driven by either a desire to, in the safety bar squat, a desire to limit the load on one of the days, or build upper back strength, or something else. And we find out over the course of a block, wow, not only is the athlete's safety bar going up, but their comp squat's going up too. Whatever formula we have in this particular case is a really good one. Let's remember that, and let's remember to heavily weight the safety bar squat the next time around. And a lot of times it's trial and error. So maybe 2 out of the 3 lifts are going well, but one isn't. So bench press isn't progressing. And like, I want to try the easy things before I try the hard things. So, we try adding more volume, or, we try changing the weekly distribution of volume to keep them more fresh for their heavy stuff, or changing technique and teaching better technique. But when you've exhausted those easy things, well, now you have to search farther afield, and you realize maybe this person is a really efficient bench presser and they have a 2-inch range of motion, so that maybe they're not getting a whole bunch of pack activation. So I'm going to give them some close grip bench to really just give them a long range of motion. And those things, I guess, are through experience, but there's no except for experience, there's no built-in process besides, a drawing board and a coach and interactions with an athlete and communication. But I'm wondering how emerging strategies gets there as well, because for you to learn about Brett Gibbs, just using Brett here because I read about it yesterday, for you to get to learning about Brett Gibbs' response to low intensity, you had to first program low intensity for him.
Yeah.
And how did you decide we're going to try low intensity? It's kind of the same thing. Am I right?
Yeah. I would agree with you. And I think it would be very interesting for us to do like a side by side of some athlete programs, even over the course of several months, to see like what the differences are. Because I mean, I'm sure there are kind of immaterial differences, but in terms of process, it sounds like this is not me trying to claim your style or anything, not at all. But I think that it just took me longer to arrive at a style of planning training that lots of people were doing, and that if I've contributed anything to it, it's the kind of systematization of it. It's the applying some heuristics around it, and then I think as time goes on, you need to at least be willing to revisit those heuristics. That the microcycles should repeat in the beginning at least, so you can parse signal from noise and all that stuff, and that doesn't really go away. But at some point, you may say, introducing a little bit of noise into the system is a trade-off that I'm willing to make. And I'm okay with that too. And to me, that's just kind of, from hearing you talk, it sounds like it's a very similar process, that there's some random variation that happens just because training has variation. And that if you're observant of what those variations are, it'll nudge you in a certain direction. You kind of keep exploring the space uh, until you learn something useful and reliable. And you have a little bit more variation within the blocks that you write. I tend to use less in the beginning. There's some differences in how block lengths are planned and stuff, but this all strikes me as very trivial differences in style. Like compared to a truly top-down approach, which is like, well, this transition block has to be 4 weeks because the accumulation block has to be 6 weeks because this is the
Mm-hmm.
second mesocycle, and that always has to, like, uh,
Yeah. I think we've arrived at that point that I really wanted to get to, of like, mainly, at least me, I can't really speak for the other guys at TSA because they do things slightly different, but a little bit more variation on a week-to-week basis than emerging strategies. I don't really use a weekly single as a measuring tool. I use like whatever their heaviest work is of the week as their measuring stick. Just because I find that singles at 8 beat athletes up a little bit too much, but you don't. And I think that's a really interesting second conversation. We've talked about that as well. But I mean, that's pretty much it. You know what I mean? Like, especially for hypertrophy, the outcomes are going to be pretty similar. There's really no effect of periodization on hypertrophy. I made sure to pull up Greg's stuff so I didn't misspeak on that. And I think emerging strategies is periodized, and that's kind of why I wanted to establish that definition of periodization earlier, because all it is structured training over time. And so the periodized stuff does tend to be more effective, especially for bench press, but not for squat, which was interesting to me. But that's not a difference in style. That's periodized versus non-periodized. So yeah, I think there's more similarities than differences.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think that, I mean, the periodization criticism is something that I've kind of rethought a bit. I do think that you'd want your periodization structure to emerge. I think I think how light should your light blocks be? How heavy should your heavy blocks be? And how many blocks? And like, there's lots of decisions that need to be made. And I'm pretty much always coming down on the side of individualizing as much as you can, and then trying not to take things for granted, for better or worse. But as you mentioned, that's still periodized, and more often than not, you come up with something that's quite similar to periodized planning, because hey, that's what most people need. The outliers are important, as I talk about quite a lot, but I guess where I was going with that is that the periodization, it's still there. I think that what needs to be brought in is more of a epistemological way of figuring out what's good for the athlete. And again, I mean, it's sounding like there's a lot of similarities in the way that we do things, which makes me feel a lot better, in terms of not going too far into left field.
Yeah, I think so too. The periodization piece, at least like classically, if we're talking about Russian periodization of like high reps, moderate reps, low reps as you progress toward some kind of competition, and in the ES, it's basically always at least one low rep or something close to it on a weekly basis. And so when it comes to peaking, the idea is you take what's worked best for the athlete and then you do that close to a competition. Is that the same for squat, bench, and deadlift? Do you find that time to peak for each lift is identical or pretty similar?
Pretty similar, yeah. And that was something that really surprised me uh, in the beginning. I expected them to be different and that to be a really difficult process to manage, but they seem to be pretty similar. But they may respond to different things. The squat may respond to more intensity and deadlift doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember right, that was the case with Brett. Um, yeah, yeah. So
And so peaking close to competition doesn't look like, you know, high or high intensity and low RPE and some kind of a taper. Or do you ever test that in advance before trying it before competition?
we have started to test it. That was one of the criticisms that Greg brought in pretty early on, and I think is pretty well founded. So yeah, we test tapers. It's a bit harder to test tapers because there's not that many of them. You do a lot of development blocks in a year, but you may only do a handful of competitions with tapers.
Yeah.
Um, so it's a bit harder to test. Um, so there's not as much variability there as well. It's like, well, if we need a taper, then there's kind of the starting point for tapers, and you make reasonable adjustments from there. But it's kind of like an evolutionary thing, right? That the more iterations you have, the more chance you have for things to vary and change. Well, there's not that many iterations of tapers, so that they tend
Mm-hmm.
to not be as varied.
Yeah. So one of my like stylistic questions, I guess, just about how you put stuff down on a page is when you have an athlete prepping for a competition and you've got this 5 week dev block that gets them, great responses. You've seen it happen, a reasonable time period ago, and you're just about ready to put it into place. Do you build in any kind of a buffer for, what if there's a slight difference in time to peak? Because
Yeah.
it strikes you as more risky to have something that looks closer to normal training, very close to a competition, if the athlete happens to be uh, pushing extra hard because they're 4 weeks out from a competition, or
Yeah.
also dieting to make weight, or all these other things that happen to come up.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think the taper helps with is so say that you're 5 exposures to peak, so you set up your final block. You might set it up for 4 exposures plus a taper because the taper is going to have some exposure to the competition exercises, and uh, there's your fifth exposure. But the or rather the competition needs to be the fifth exposure. Um, so I kind of threw that off by a week, but I think you understand where I'm going with it. The idea is that taper is going to have some exposure to the competition exercise, but the overall stress of that week is going to be a lot less. So if you've got an athlete who is cutting weight or who's just nervous, I find that just people tend to underappreciate the amount of nerves in the even the week leading up to a competition that can have a notable effect, or at least it seems like nerves, I guess. But um, yeah, yeah. So kind of allowing for a little bit of extra space, and I do find that most people still peak as predicted. I do see that if there's an exception, it's to peaking a little bit early. So to be on the safe side, the taper can help with that. Or if you just, you know, edge things a little bit early, so that you're not pushing quite all the way to that peak condition.
Mhm.
I think it's better for an athlete to be a little bit early for the peak than late.
Oh yeah, hell yeah.
Yeah,
No one wants to hit their best lifts a week out and then underperform compared to those in competition, whatever the case may be.
Right.
But yeah, that's another interesting thing I haven't really talked about. So like an athlete's doing singles at what is the heaviest they'd go before competition, singles at 8 or heavier, or kind of what's kind of peak intensity leading into a competition, or is it really variable?
It is quite variable. Single at 8 RPE seems to be where I go for most people. I do find that some people will, especially if they just don't respond well to high intensity stuff, it's better to, kind of not. I've even had people go into competitions not doing anything that we would consider heavy, like 80, 85% work. And it's gone very well if that's what they tend to respond well to. Yeah.
Yeah, the question just about how to get there, I guess, is just following the training response.
Yeah.
And so does it then seem like an athlete is peaking throughout the year, doing what might be work that's 2 weeks out from a competition, 5 or 6 or 10 times per year, depending on how often they're doing dev cycles?
I think it depends a bit on what you mean by peaking. So in kind of the Bondarchuk terminology, the end of each development cycle is met with a peak condition, just meaning that that's your peak performance for the development cycle. And that I think, I may have some of his doctrine wrong on this, but I think that, kind of in an ideal setting, each of those peak conditions would be, a personal best or near personal best performance in an ideal world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that he feels like there's something valuable at training at that level, So if, your squat PR is 300 kilos, that there's something valuable at training at that level, and that, if you're only capable of 280 at a given point, that, that's all you're capable of, and that you may be peaked relative to that, but that's not the same as being, at an all-time best. So I think that's kind of how he looks at it. I suppose I tend to think along similar lines. Like his idea is that the more peaks that you get in a year, the better off you'll be. If you think that there's something valuable about peak conditions, then having more peak conditions is better. So that kind of goes back to having one workout on repeat. Well, you'll reach your peak, your time to peak number of exposures quickly, and then so you kind of get all that you can out of this stimulus, and then you move on to the next stimulus. You get more peaks per year and better year-over-year growth. At least that's the model. I suppose I'm a little bit different because we don't push the microcycle frequency just as hard as you can. We tend to think that you've kind of got to look for a balance, like what gives you the best like gain rate per week, almost, on average, of course. But the idea that you could push frequency and get more peaks per year, but those are smaller peaks. Then you could go lower frequency, get fewer peaks per year, but have bigger peaks. Which one leads to the best year-over-year progress?
Right. Yeah. And the reality is it takes some amount of time to gain strength, regardless of whether we like it or not.
Absolutely.
And so, you just need a certain amount of time to bake the cookies before they're done. You can't pull them out, and that's 6 minutes.
Right. The cookies at a higher temperature doesn't necessarily fix that problem, right?
Yeah, I've seen this meme. It's why cook at 10 minutes at 400 degrees when you can cook for 15 seconds at 1500 degrees.
Exactly.
So there's kind of in this periodization, I wrote down like these 4 fundamental concepts that I think were going to guide our conversation. And they were predictability. So how can we understand future training based on current training? And that has to do with individualization. That has to do with kind of creating standards and a bottom-up approach. Pattern recognition, same kind of thing, figuring out what in the present applies to the future, and then some kind of Goldilocks zone about keeping athletes in the sweet spot for more of the year, and then that variation piece that we talked about. So thank you so much for taking some time to chat about these.
Well, thank you, man. I feel a little bit bad, like we have this talk and I'm making you do a lot of the work, but I really appreciate your perspectives and inputs and criticisms here. You're definitely one of the coaches that I think is doing a good job of individualizing training and whatnot. And it's comforting to me to think that we're coming down in similar places rather than different places. And then if we can
I'd be interested
operationalize
to
this.
Oh, for real. Yeah. I'd be interested to kind of get a survey of our industry and see how many are truly operating under like a top down, I don't know, whatever that kind of model is.
Just kind of seeing what the trade-off is, or where people are drawing the line on that spectrum.
Right.
Yeah, man. Good chatting with you, and I'm gonna hold you to that additional conversation with Eric, Greg, you and I.
Great. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, man.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the RTS podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it to your friends, share it on Instagram, wherever you are on social media. If you use TikTok, if you're one of the 5 people that use TikTok that watch this video, share it over there. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we have a free online training log that you can use to log your training, track your training, run block reviews, perform stress index reports, and ultimately learn about what works for your training. So if you're interested in that, go to www.reactivetrainingsystems.com, and we will see you in the next episode.